Section V. Ecclesiastical institutions. Roman political institutions were based on the cities, on which the surrounding country was dependent, and Christian organization followed the same rule. The country districts were dependent upon and were cared for by the city bishops and their appointees, save where, in the east, there were country bishops. The Germanic invasions altered this situation. By the 6th century the beginnings of the parish system were to be found in France, Ante, page 166. There it rapidly grew, and it was stimulated by the custom of the foundation of churches by large landowners. The founders and their heirs retained the right of nominating the incumbent. This situation left episcopal control uncertain. Charlemagne, therefore, provided that besides the right of ordination of all parish priests, the bishop should have visitorial and disciplinary power throughout his diocese. The churchly status was further strengthened by the full legal establishment of tithes. Long favored by the clergy through Old Testament example, they were demanded by a Frankish synod in Macon, in 585. By Pippin they were treated as a legal charge, and full legal sanction was given them by Charlemagne. They were to be collected not only by bishops, but by and for the use of the incumbent of each parish. Moreover, constant gifts of lands to the church had raised ecclesiastical possessions, by the time of the early Carolingians, to a third of the soil of France. The great holdings were a constant temptation in the financial need of a Charles Martel, who appropriated much, but under the friendly government of Charlemagne they were respected, if earlier confiscations were not restored. Under Charlemagne, preaching was encouraged and books of sermons prepared. Confession was favored, though not yet obligatory. Every Christian was expected to be able to repeat the Lord's Prayer and the Apostles' Creed. Charlemagne renewed and extended the metropolitan system, which had fallen into abeyance. At the beginning of his reign there was but one metropolitan in the Frankish kingdom. At its end there were 22. These were now generally known as archbishops, a title which goes back to the time of Athanasius, though long loosely used. In Carolingian theory the archbishop was the judge and disciplinary officer of the bishops of his province, possessed of powers which the growth of papal jurisdiction was soon to curtail. It was also his duty to call frequent synods to consider the religious problems of the archdiocese, or as it was usually styled, the province. For the better regulation of his immediate clerical assistants, Bishop Crodgang of Metz introduced, about 760, a semi-monastic life in common, which was favored and spread by Charlemagne. From the designation of this life as the Wta Canonica, the name, canons, for the clergy attached to a cathedral or collegiate church arose. Their place of meeting was called the capitulum, or chapter, a title soon applied to the canons themselves. By this means the life and work of the bishop and his immediately associated clergy was largely regulated. Charlemagne himself designated the bishops of his realm. In all these changes, save that of personal authority over episcopal appointments, Charlemagne was but carrying further the reforms begun by Boniface. Much that he completed his father, Pippin, had commenced. At Charlemagne's death, the Frankish Church was in a far better state of education, discipline, and efficiency than it had been under the later Merovingians and early Carolingians. Section 6. Collapsing empire and rising papacy. Charlemagne's great power was personal. Scarcely had he died when the rapid decline of his empire began. His son and successor, Louis the Pious, 814–840, was of excellent personal character, but wholly unequal to the task left by Charlemagne, or even to the control of his own sons, who plotted against him and quarreled with one another. After his death they divided the East. With the beginning of the 10th century, the raids of the Hungarians brought devastation to Germany and Italy. Under these circumstances, when national unity or defense was impossible, feudalism developed with great rapidity. Its roots run back to the declining days of the Roman Empire, but with the death of Charlemagne it was given great impetus. It was intensely divisive, substituting for any strong central government many local seats of authority, jealous one of another and engaged in constant struggle. Churches and monasteries became largely the prey of local nobles, or defended their rights with difficulty as parts of the feudal system. This social and political form of organization was to dominate Europe till the 13th century, and largely to make possible the growth of the medieval papacy. The impulse given to learning by Charlemagne did not immediately die. At the court of Charles the Bald, John Scotus, 877, to whom the name Erigena was much later added, held somewhat the same position that Alcuin had occupied under Charlemagne. He translated the much-admired writings of the Pseudo-Dionysius, Ante, page 171, and developed his own Neoplatonic philosophy, which his age was too ignorant to judge heretical or orthodox. In Germany, Rabanus Maurus, 776-856, abbot of Fulda and Archbishop of Mainz, a pupil of Alcuin, attained a deserved reputation as a teacher, commentator on the scriptures, furtherer of clerical education and author of what was well nigh an encyclopedia. In Heinmar, 805-882, Archbishop of Reims, France possessed not only a prelate of great assertiveness and influence, but a theological controversialist of decided gift. The renewed study of Augustine which this intellectual revival effected led to two doctrinal controversies. The first was regarding the nature of Christ's presence in the supper. About 831 Paschasius Radbertus, a monk of the monastery of Corbie, near Amiens, of remarkable learning in Greek as well as in Latin theology, set forth the first thoroughgoing treatise on the Lord's Supper, De Corporii et Sanguine Domini. In it he taught with Augustine, that only those who partake in faith receive the virtue of the sacrament, and with the Greeks, that it is the food of immortality, and also, that by divine miracle the substance is made the very body and blood of Christ. That was transubstantiation, though the word was not to be coined before the 12th century. To Radbertus, Rabanus Maurus replied, but a more elaborate answer was that of a fellow monk of Corbie, Ratramnus, about 844. Yet his view agreed in much with that of Radbertus. The body and blood of Christ are mysteriously present, yet they are not identical with the body that suffered on the cross. The controversy was not decided at the time, but the future, in the Roman Church, was with Radbertus. The second controversy was aroused by Gottschalk, 808-8682. A monk of Fulda, made so by parental dedication, his efforts for release from his bonds were frustrated by Rabanus Maurus. He then turned to the study of Augustine, and his hard fate, perhaps, led him to emphasize a double divine predestination to life or to death. He was attacked by Rabanus Maurus and Hincmar, but found vigorous defenders. Condemned as a heretic at a synod in Mainz in 848, he spent the next 20 years in monastic imprisonment, persecuted by Hincmar, and refusing to retract. The controversy was a fresh flaring up of the old dispute between thoroughgoing Augustinianism and the semi-Pelagianism which was the actual theory of a large portion of the Church. As the collapse of Charlemagne's empire grew more complete, however, these controversies and the intellectual life out of which they sprang faded. By 900 a renewed barbarism had largely extinguished the light which had shone brightly a century before. One great exception to this general condition existed. In England, Alfred the Great, 871-9017, distinguished as the successful opponent of the Danish co. Aim one of the most remarkable of forgeries, the so-called pseudo-Isidorian decretals purporting to be collected by a certain Isidore Mercator, by whom Isidore of Seville, Ante, page 193, and Marius Mercator were doubtless intended. It consisted of decisions of popes and councils from Clement of Rome in the 1st century to Gregory II in the 8th, part genuine and part forged. The Donation of Constantine, Ante, page 204, is included. The early popes therein claim for themselves supreme jurisdiction. All bishops may appeal directly to papal authority. Intervening archiepiscopal rights are limited, and neither papacy nor bishops are subject to secular control. With its origin the papacy had nothing to do, but it was to be used mightily to the furtherance of papal claims. The age was uncritical. It passed immediately as genuine, and was not exposed till the Reformation had awakened historical study. With the decline of imperial power, the independence of the papacy rapidly rose. The popes showed themselves the strongest men in Italy. Leo IV, 847-855, aided by South Italian cities, defeated the Saracens and surrounded the quarter of St. Peter's in Rome with a wall, the Leonine city. In Nicholas I, 858-867, the Roman see had its ablest and most assertive occupant between Gregory the Great and Hildebrand. He sketched out a program of papal claims, hardly surpassed later, but which the papacy was to be centuries in achieving. Nicholas attempted to realize the ideals of Augustine's City of God. In his thought, the Church is superior to all earthly powers, the ruler of the whole Church is the Pope, and the bishops are his agents. These conceptions he was able to make effective in two notable cases, in which he had also the advantage of choosing the side on which right lay. The first was that of Thietberga, the injured wife of Lothair II of Lorraine. Divorced that sovereign might marry his concubine, Waldrada, she appealed to Nicholas, who declared void the sanctioning decision of a synod held in Metz, in 863, and excommunicated the archbishops of Trier and Cologne who had supported Lothair. The Pope had defended helpless womanhood, he none the less humbled two of the most powerful German prelates and thwarted a German ruler. In the second case, Nicholas received the appeal of the deposed Bishop Rodhat of Soissons, who had been removed by the overbearing Archbishop Hincmar of Reims, and forced his restoration. Here Nicholas appeared as the protector of the bishops against their metropolitans and the defender of their right to appeal to the Pope as the final judge. In this quarrel the pseudo-Isidorian decretals were first employed in Rome. In a third case, Nicholas, though having right on his side, was less successful. The emperor in Constantinople, Michael III, the drunkard, was ruled by his uncle, Bardas, a man of unsavory reputation. The patriarch, Ignatius, refused Bardas the sacrament, and was deposed. In his place, Bardas procured the appointment of one of the most learned men of the later Greek world, Photius, Patriarch 858-867, 878-886, then a layman. Ignatius, thus injured, appealed to Nicholas, who sent legates to Constantinople. They joined in approval of Photius. The Pope repudiated their action, and, in 863, declared Photius deposed. Photius now accused the Western Church of heresy for admitting the Filioque clause to the Creed, fasting on Saturdays, using milk, butter, and cheese in Lent, demanding priestly celibacy, and confining confirmation to the bishops. At a synod under his leadership in Constantinople, in 867, the Pope was condemned. Nicholas failed in his attempt to exercise his authority over the Eastern Church. The ill feeling between East and West was but augmented, which was to lead, in 1054, to the complete separation of the churches. During this period following the death of Charlemagne important missionary efforts were begun. Ansgar, 8017-865, a monk of Corbie, entered Denmark in 826, but was drive. Constantinople and Rome, Boris finally chose spiritual allegiance to the former, since the Patriarch of Constantinople was willing to recognize a self-governing Bulgarian church. This adhesion was of immense consequence in determining the future growth of the Greek Church in Eastern Europe. The most celebrated missionaries among the Slavs were, however, the brothers Cyril, 869, and Methodius, 885. Natives of Thessalonica, they had attained high position in the Eastern Empire. On the request of Rostislav, Duke of Moravia, the Eastern Emperor, Michael III, sent the brothers thither in 864. There they labored with great success. A struggle of several years between the papacy and Constantinople for possession of this new-won territory resulted in the ultimate victory of Rome. The use of a Slavic liturgy was permitted by Pope John VIII, 872-882, though soon withdrawn, but from this source its worship came ultimately to the Russian Church. From Moravia, Christianity in its Roman form came to Bohemia about the close of the 9th century. Section 7. Papal decline and renewal by the revived empire. It may seem strange that the papacy which showed such power under Nicholas I should within 25 years of his death have fallen into its lowest degradation. The explanation is the growing anarchy of the times. Up to a certain point the collapse of the empire aided the development of papal authority. That passed, the papacy became the sport of the Italian nobles and ultimately of whatever faction was in control of Rome, since the pope was chosen by the clergy and people of the city. The papacy could now appeal for aid to no strong outside political power as Zacharias had to Pippin against the Lombards. At the close of the 9th century the papacy was involved in the quarrels for the possession of Italy. Stephen V, 885-891, was overborne by Guido, Duke of Spoleto, and compelled to grant him the empty imperial title. Formosus, 891–896, was similarly dependent, and crowned Guido's son, Lambert, emperor in 892. From this situation Formosus sought relief in 893 by calling in the aid of Arnulf, whom the Germans had chosen king in 887. In 895 Arnulf captured Rome, and was crowned emperor by Formosus the next year. A few months later Lambert was in turn master of Rome, and his partisan, Stephen VI, 896–897, had the remains of the lately deceased Formosus disinterred, condemned in a synod, and treated with extreme indignity. A riot, however, thrust Stephen VI into prison, where he was strangled. Popes now followed one another in rapid succession, as the various factions controlled Rome. Between the death of Stephen VI, 897, and the accession of John XII, 955, no less than 17 occupied the papal throne. The controlling influences in the opening years of the 10th century were those of the Roman noble Theophylact, and his notorious daughters, Marozia and Theodora. The popes were their creatures. From 932 to his death in 954 Rome was controlled by Marozia's son Alberic, a man of strength, ability, and character, who did much for churchly reforms in Rome, but nevertheless secured the appointment of his partisans as popes. On his death he was succeeded as temporal ruler of Rome by his son Octavian, who had few of the father's rough virtues. Though without moral fitness for the office, Octavian secured his own election as pope in 955, choosing as his name in this capacity John XII, 955–964, being one of the earliest popes to take a new name on election. He altered the whole Roman situation and introduced a new chapter in the history of the papacy, by calling for aid upon the able German sovereign, Otto I, against the threatening power of Berengar Li, who had gained control of a large part of Italy. The line of Charlemagne came to an end in Germany, in 911, with the death of Louis the Child. With the disintegration of the Carolingian Empire and the growth of feudalism, Germany threatened to fall into its tribal divisions, Bavaria, Swabia. 73. Otto's first work was the consolidation of his kingdom. He made the semi-independent dukes effectively his vassals. In this work he used above all the aid of the bishops and great abbots. They controlled large territories of Germany, and by filling these posts with his adherents, their forces, coupled with his own, were sufficient to enable Otto to control any hostile combination of lay nobles. He named the bishops and abbots, and under him they became, as they were to continue to the Napoleonic Wars, lay rulers as well as spiritual prelates. The peculiar constitution of Germany thus arose, by which the imperial power was based on control of ecclesiastical appointments, a situation which was to lead to the investiture struggle with the papacy in the next century. As Otto extended his power he founded new bishoprics on the borders of his kingdom, partly political and partly missionary in aim, as Brandenburg and Havelberg among the Slavs, and Schleswig, Ripon, and Aarhus for the Danes. He also established the Archbishopric of Magdeburg. Had Otto confined his work to Germany it would have been for the advantage of that land, and for the permanent upbuilding of a strong central monarchy. He was, however, attracted by Italy, and established relations there of the utmost historic importance, but which were destined to dissipate the strength of Germany for centuries. A first invasion in 951 made him master of northern Italy. Rebellion at home, 953, and a great campaign against the Hungarians, 955, interrupted his Italian enterprise, but in 961 he once more invaded Italy, invited by Pope John XII, then hard-pressed by Berengar I, Anti, page 215. On February 2, 962, Otto was crowned in Rome by John XII as emperor, an event which, though in theory continuing the succession of the Roman emperors from Augustus and Charlemagne, was the inauguration of the Holy Roman Empire, which was to continue in name till 1806. Theoretically, the emperor was the head of secular Christendom, so constituted with the approval of the Church expressed by coronation by the papacy. Practically, he was a more or less powerful German ruler, with Italian possessions, on varying terms with the popes. John XII soon tired of Otto's practical control, and plotted against him. Otto, of strong religious feeling, to whom such a pope was an offense, doubtless was also moved by a desire to strengthen his hold on the German bishops by securing a more worthy and compliant head of the Church. In 963 Otto compelled the Roman people to swear to choose no pope without his consent, caused John XII to be deposed, and brought about the choice of Leo VIII, 963–965. The new pope stood solely by imperial support. On Otto's departure John XII resumed his papacy, and on John's death the Roman factions chose Benedict V. Once more Otto returned, forced Benedict into exile, restored Leo VIII, and after Leo's speedy demise, caused the choice of John XIII, 965–972. Otto had rescued the papacy, for the time being, from the Roman nobles, but at the cost of subserviency to himself. Otto's son and successor, Otto II, 973–983, pursued substantially the same policy at home, and regarding the papacy, as his father, though with a weaker hand. His son, Otto III, 983–1002, went further. The Roman nobles had once more controlled the papacy in his minority, but in 996 he entered Rome, put them down, and caused his cousin Bruno to be made pope as Gregory V, 996–999, the first German to hold the papal office. After Gregory's decease Otto III placed on the papal throne his tutor, Gerbert, Archbishop of Reims, as Sylvester II, 999–1003, the first French pope, and the most learned man of the age. The death of Otto III ended the direct line of Otto I, and the throne was secured by Henry II, 1002–1024, Duke of Bavaria and great-grandson of Henry the Fowler. A man filled with sincere desire to improve the state of the Church, he yet felt himself forced by the difficulties in securing and maintaining H.T.M.E.N.S. With Rome he did not interfere. There the Tusculan party secured the papacy for Benedict VIII brother, John XIX, 1024–1032, and on his death for his 12-year-old nephew, Benedict IX, 1033–1048, both unworthy, and the latter one of the worst occupants of the papal throne. An intolerable situation arose at Rome, which was ended, see page 221, by Conrad's able and far more religious son, Henry III, emperor from 1039 to 1056. Charlemagne himself valued monasticism more for its educational and cultural work than for its ascetic ideals. Those ideals appealed, however, in Charlemagne's reign to a soldier nobleman of southern France, Witiza, or as he was soon known, Benedict, 750–821, called of Anian, from the monastery founded by him in 779. Benedict's aim was to secure everywhere the full ascetic observation of the rule of Benedict of Nursia, Ante, page 139. The educational or industrial side of monasticism appealed little to him. He would raise monasticism to greater activity in worship, contemplation, and self-denial. Under Louis the Pious Benedict became that emperor's chief monastic advisor, and by imperial order, in 816 and 817, Benedict of Anian's interpretation of the elder Benedict's rule was made binding on all monasteries of the empire. Undoubtedly a very considerable improvement in their condition resulted. Most of these benefits were lost, however, in the collapse of the empire, in which monasticism shared in the common fall. The misery of the times itself had the effect of turning men's minds from the world, and of magnifying the ascetic ideal. By the early years of the 10th century a real ascetic revival of religion was beginning that was to grow in strength for more than 2 centuries. Its first conspicuous illustration was the foundation in 910 by Duke William the Pious, of Aquitaine, of the monastery of Cluny, not far from Macon in eastern France. Cluny was to be free from all episcopal or worldly jurisdiction, self-governing, but under the protection of the Pope. Its lands were to be secure from all invasion or secularization, and its rule that of Benedict, interpreted with great ascetic strictness. Cluny was governed by a series of abbots of remarkable character and ability. Under the first and second of these, Berno, 910–927, and Odo, 927–942, it had many imitators, through their energetic work. Even the Mother Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino, in Italy, was reformed on Cluny lines, and, favored by Alberic, a monastery, St. Mary on the Aventine Hill, was founded which represented Cluny ideas in Rome. By the death of Odo the Cluny movement was widespread in France and Italy. It was no part of the original purpose of Cluny to bring other monasteries into dependence on it, or to develop far-reaching churchly political plans. Its aim was a monastic reformation by example and influence. Yet even at the death of the first abbot 5 or 6 monasteries were under the control of the abbot of Cluny. Under the 5th abbot, Odilo, 994-1048, however, Cluny became the head of a congregation, since he brought all monasteries founded or reformed by Cluny into dependence on the mother house, their heads being appointed by and responsible to the abbot of Cluny himself. This was new in monasticism, and it made Cluny practically an order, under a single head, with all the strength and influence that such a constitution implies. It now came to have a force comparable with that of the Dominicans or Jesuits of later times. With this growth came an enlargement of the reformatory aims of the Cluny movement. An illustration is the Truce of God. Though not originated by Cluny, it was taken up and greatly furthered by Abbot Odilo from 1040 onward. Its aim was to limit the constant petty wars between nobles by prescribing a closed season in memory of Christ's Passion, from Wednesday evening till Monday morning, during which acts of violence should be visited with severe ecclesiastical punishments. Its purpose was estature by a layman as simony, and had as its reformatory ideal a papacy strong enough to take from the kings and princes what it deemed their usurped powers of clerical designation. This was the section that was to support Hildebrand in his great contest. Elsewhere than in the Cluny movement ascetic reform was characteristic of the 10th and 11th centuries. In Lorraine and Flanders a monastic revival of large proportions was instituted by Gerhard, abbot of Brunn, 959. In Italy, Romuald of Ravenna, 950-1027, organized settlements of hermits, called deserts, in which the strictest asceticism was practiced, and from which missionaries and preachers went forth. The most famous desert, which still exists and gave its name to the movement, is that of Camaldoli, near Arezzo. Even more famous was Peter Damiani, 1007-1072, likewise of Ravenna, a fiery supporter of monastic reform, an opponent of simony and clerical marriage, who was, for a time, Cardinal Bishop of Ostia, and a leading ecclesiastical figure in Italy in the advancement of Hildebrandian ideas, preceding Hildebrand's papacy. It is evident that before the middle of the 11th century a strong movement for churchly reform was making itself felt. Henry II had, in large measure, sympathized with it, page 218. Henry III, 1039-1056, was even more under its influence. Abbot Hugh of Cluny, 1049-1109, was a close friend of that emperor, while the Empress, Agnes, from Aquitaine, had been brought up in heartiest sympathy with the Cluny party, of which her father had been a devoted adherent. Henry III was personally of a religious nature, and though he had no hesitation in controlling ecclesiastical appointments for political reasons as fully as his father, Conrad IH, he would take no money for so doing, denounced simony, and appointed bishops of high character and reformatory zeal. The situation in Rome demanded Henry III interference, for it had now become an intolerable scandal. Benedict IX, placed on the throne by the Tusculan party, had proved so unworthy that its rivals, the nobles of the Crescenzio faction, were able to drive him out of Rome, in 1044, and install their representative as Sylvester III in his stead. Benedict, however, was soon back in partial possession of the city, and now, tiring temporarily of his high office, and probably planning marriage, he sold it in 1045 for a price variously stated as £1,000 or £2,000 of silver. The purchaser was a Roman archpriest of good repute for piety, John Gratian, who took the name Gregory VI. Apparently the purchase was known to few. Gregory was welcomed at first by reformers like Peter Damiani. The scandal soon became public property. Benedict IX refused to lay down the papacy, and there were now 3 popes in Rome, each in possession of one of the principal churches, and each denouncing the other 2. Henry III now interfered. At a synod held by him in Sutri in December, 1046, Sylvester III was deposed, and Gregory VI compelled to resign and banished to Germany. A few days later, a synod in Rome, under imperial supervision, deposed Benedict IX. Henry III immediately nominated and the overawed clergy and people of the city elected a German, Suiger, Bishop of Bamberg, as Clement II, 1046–1047. Henry III had reached the high-water mark of imperial control over the papacy. So grateful did its rescue from previous degradation appear that the Reformed party did not at first seriously criticize this imperial domination, but it could not long go on without raising the question of the independence of the Church. The very thoroughness of Henry's work soon roused opposition. Henry III had repeated occasion to show his control of the papal office. Clement II soon died, and Henry caused another bishop of his empire to be placed on the papal throne as Damasus II. The new pope survived but a few months. Henry now appointed to the vacant see his cousin Bruno, Bishop of Toul, a thoroughgoing reformer. In Rs or head presbyters were the cardinal, or leading priests of Rome. In a similar way, the heads of the charity districts into which Rome was divided in the 3rd century were known as the cardinal, or leading deacons. At a later period, but certainly by the 8th century, the bishops in the immediate vicinity of Rome, the suburbicarian, or suburban bishops, were called the cardinal bishops. This division of the College of Cardinals into cardinal bishops, cardinal priests, and cardinal deacons persists to the present day. As the leading clergy of Rome and vicinity, they were, long before the name cardinal became exclusively or even primarily attached to them, the Pope's chief aides and advisors. On attaining the papacy, Leo IX found the cardinalate filled with Romans, and so far as they were representative of the noble factions which had long controlled the papacy before Henry III's intervention, with men unsympathetic with reform. Leo IX appointed to several of these high places men of reformatory zeal from other parts of Western Christendom. He thus largely changed the sympathies of the cardinalate, surrounded himself with trusted assistants, and in considerable measure rendered the cardinalate thenceforth representative of the Western Church as a whole and not simply of the local Roman community. It was a step of far-reaching consequence. 3 of these appointments were of special significance. Humbert, a monk of Lorraine, was made cardinal bishop, and to his death in 1061 was to be a leading opponent of lay investiture and a force in papal politics. Hugh the White, a monk from the vicinity of Toul, who was to live till after 1098, became a cardinal priest, was long to be a supporter of reform, only to become for the last 20 years of his life the most embittered of opponents of Hildebrand and his successors. Finally, Hildebrand himself, who had accompanied Leo IX from Germany, was made a subdeacon, charged with the financial administration, in some considerable measure, of the Roman See. Leo IX appointed other men of power and reformatory zeal to important, if less prominent, posts in Rome and its vicinity. Hildebrand, who now came into association with the cardinalate, is the most remarkable personality in medieval papal history. A man of diminutive stature and unimpressive appearance, his power of intellect, firmness of will, and limitlessness of design made him the outstanding figure of his age. Born in humble circumstances in Tuscany, not far from the year 1020, he was educated in the Cluny monastery of Ot. Mary on the Aventine in Rome, and early inspired with the most radical of reformatory ideals. He accompanied Gregory VI to Germany on that unlucky pope's banishment, page 221, and thence returned to Rome with Leo IX. Probably he was already a monk, but whether he was ever in Cluny itself is doubtful. He was, however, still a young man, and to ascribe to him the leading influence under the vigorous Leo IX is an error. Leo was rather his teacher. Leo IX entered vigorously on the work of reform. He stood in cordial relations with its chief leaders, Hugo, abbot of Cluny, Peter Damiani, and Frederick of Lorraine. He made extensive journeys to Germany and France, holding synods and enforcing papal authority. At his first Easter Synod in Rome, in 1049, he condemned simony and priestly marriage in the severest terms. A synod held under his presidency in Reims the same year affirmed the principle of canonical election: no one shall be promoted to ecclesiastical rulership without the choice of the clergy and people. By these journeys and assemblies the influence of the papacy was greatly raised. In his relations with southern Italy and with Constantinople, Leo IX was less fortunate. The advancing claims of the Normans, who since 1016 had been gradually conquering the lower part of the peninsula, were opposed by the Pope, who asserted possession for the papacy. Papal interference with the churches, especially by the Normans. He did not long survive this catastrophe, dying in 1054. On the death of Leo IX, Henry III appointed another German, Bishop Gebhard of Eichstätt, as Pope. He took the title of Victor II, 1055–1057. Though friendly to the Reform Party, Victor IT was a devoted admirer of his imperial patron, and on the unexpected death of the great emperor in 1156, did much to secure the quiet succession of Henry III's son Henry IV, then a boy of 6, under the regency of the empress mother, Agnes. Less than a year later Victor II died. Section X, the papacy breaks with the empire. Henry III's dominance was undoubtedly displeasing to the more radical reformers, who had endured it partly of necessity, since it was not apparent how the papacy could otherwise be freed from the control of the Roman nobles, and partly because of Henry's sympathy with many features of the reform movement. Henry himself had been so firmly entrenched in his control of the German Church, and of the papacy itself, that the logical consequences of the reform movement appear not to have been clear to him. Now he was gone. A weak regency had taken his place. The time seemed ripe to the reformers for an advance which should lessen imperial control, or, if possible, end it altogether. On Victor II's death the Romans, led by the Reformed clergy, chose Frederick of Lorraine Pope as Stephen IX, 1057–1058, without consulting the German regent. A thoroughgoing reformer, the new pope was the brother of Duke Godfrey of Lorraine, an enemy of the German imperial house, who by his marriage with the Countess Beatrice of Tuscany had become the strongest noble in northern Italy. Under Stephen, Cardinal Humbert now issued a program for the Reform Party in his 3 books against the Simoniacs, in which he declared all lay appointment invalid and, in especial, attacked lay investiture, that is the gift by the emperor of a ring and a staff to the elected bishop in token of his induction into office. The victory of these principles would undermine the foundations of the imperial power in Germany. Their strenuous assertion could but lead to a struggle of gigantic proportions. Nevertheless, Stephen did not dare push matters too far. He, therefore, sent Hildebrand and Bishop Anselm of Lucca, who secured the approval of the Empress Agnes for his papacy. Scarcely had this been obtained when Stephen died in Florence. Stephen's death provoked a crisis. The Roman nobles reasserted their old authority over the papacy and chose their own partisan, Benedict X, only a week later. The reformed cardinals had to flee. Their cause seemed for the moment lost. The situation was saved by the firmness and political skill of Hildebrand. He secured the approval of Godfrey of Tuscany and of a part of the people of Rome for the candidacy of Gerhard, Bishop of Florence, a reformer and, like Godfrey, a native of Lorraine. A representative of this Roman minority obtained the consent of the regent, Agnes. Hildebrand now gathered the reformed cardinals in Siena, and Gerhard was there chosen as Nicholas II, 1058–1061. The military aid of Godfrey of Tuscany soon made the new pope master of Rome. Under Nicholas II the real power was that of Hildebrand, and in lesser degree of the cardinals Humbert and Peter Damiani. The problem was to free the papacy from the control of the Roman nobles without coming under the overlordship of the emperor. Some physical support for the papacy must be found. The aid of Tuscany could be counted as assured. Beatrice and her daughter, Matilda, were to be indefatigable in assistance. Yet Tuscany was not sufficient. Under the skillful guidance of Hildebrand, Nicholas II entered into cordial relations with the Normans, who had caused Leo IX so much trouble, recognized their conquests, and received them as vassals of the papacy. With like ability, intimate connections were now established, largely through the agency of Peter Damiani and Bishop Anselm of Lucca, with the Democratic Party. Ion. Its chief author seems to have been Cardinal Humbert. It provided that, on the death of a pope, the cardinal bishop shall first consider as to his successor and then advise with the other cardinals. Only after their selection has been made should the suffrages of the other clergy and people be sought. In studiously vague language, the document guards the honor and reverence due to our beloved son Henry, that is the youthful Henry, v but does not in the least define the emperor's share in the choice. The evident purpose was to put the election into the hands of the cardinals, primarily of the cardinal bishops. It was, furthermore, provided that the pope might come from anywhere in the church, that the election could be held elsewhere than in Rome in case of necessity, and that the pope chosen should possess the powers of his office immediately on election wherever he might be. This was, indeed, a revolution in the method of choice of the pope, and would give to the office an independence of political control not heretofore possessed. Scarcely had these new political and constitutional results been achieved than they were imperiled by the death of Nicholas II in 1061. That of the energetic Cardinal Humbert also occurred the same year. Hildebrand became more than ever the ruling force in the Reform party. Within less than 3 months of Nicholas's death, Hildebrand had secured the election of his friend Anselm, Bishop of Lucca, as Alexander II, 1061–1073. The German bishops were hostile, however, to the new method to papal election. The Lombard prelates disliked the papal support of the Patriaria, and the Roman nobles resented their loss of control over the papacy. These hostile elements now united, and at a German assembly held in Basel in 1061 procured from the Empress Regent the appointment as Pope of Catullus, Bishop of Parma, who took the name of Honorius II. In the struggle that followed, Honorius nearly won, but a revolution in Germany in 1062 placed the chief power in that realm and the guardianship of the young Henry IV in the hands of the ambitious Anno, Archbishop of Cologne. Anno wished to stand well with the Reform party, and through his influence on the side of Alexander, who was declared the rightful pope at a synod of German and Italian prelates held in Mantua in 1064. Thus Hildebrand's bold policy triumphed over a divided Germany. Alexander II, with Hildebrand's guidance, advanced the papal authority markedly. Anno of Cologne and Siegfried of Mainz, 2 of the most powerful prelates of Germany, were compelled to do penance for simony. He prevented Henry IV from securing a divorce from Queen Bertha. He lent his approval to William the Conqueror's piratical expedition which resulted in the Norman conquest of England in 1066, and further aided William's plans by the establishment of Norman bishops in the principal English sees. He gave his sanction to the efforts of the Normans of southern Italy which were to result in the conquest of Sicily. Meanwhile Henry IV came of age in 1065. Far from being a weak king, he soon showed himself one of the most resourceful of German rulers. It was inevitable that the papal policy regarding ecclesiastical appointments should clash with that historic control by German sovereigns on which their power in the empire so largely rested. The actual dispute came over the archbishopric of Milan, a post of the first importance for the control of northern Italy. Henry had appointed Godfrey of Castiglione, whom Alexander had charged with simony. The Patriaria of Milan chose a certain Atto, whom Alexander recognized as rightful archbishop. In spite of that act, Henry now secured Godfrey's consecration, in 1073, to the disputed post. The struggle was fully on. The contest involved the power of the imperial government and the claims of the radical papal Reform party. Alexander looked upon Henry as a well-intentioned young man, misled by bad advice, and he therefore excommunicated not Henry High. Rather than Hildebrand, was probably the author of the famous Dictatus. It well expresses Hildebrand's principles, that the Roman Church was founded by God alone. That the Roman pontiff alone can with right be called universal. That he alone can depose or reinstate bishops. That he alone may use, i.e., dispose of, the imperial insignia. That it may be permitted him to depose emperors. That he himself may be judged of no one. That he may absolve subjects from their fealty to wicked men. It was nothing less than an ideal of world rulership. In view of later experience it may be called impracticable and even unchristian, but neither Hildebrand nor his age had had that experience. It was a great ideal of a possible regenerated human society, affected by obedience to commanding spiritual power, and as such was deserving of respect in those who held it, and worthy of that trial which alone could reveal its value or worthlessness. The opening years of Hildebrand's pontificate were favorable for the papacy. A rebellion against Henry IV by his Saxon subjects, who had many grievances, and the discontent of the nobles of other regions kept Henry fully occupied. In 1074 he did penance in Nuremberg before the papal legates, and promised obedience. At the Easter Synod in Rome in 1075, Hildebrand renewed the decree against lay investiture, denying to Henry any share in creating bishops. A few months later Henry's fortunes changed. In June, 1075, his defeat of the Saxons made him apparently master of Germany, and his attitude toward the papacy speedily altered. Henry once more made an appointment to the Archbishopric of Milan. Hildebrand replied, in December, 1075, with a letter calling Henry to severe account. 2 On January 24, 1076, Henry, with his nobles and bishops, held a council in Worms, at which the turncoat cardinal, Hugh the White, was forward with personal charges against Hildebrand. There a large portion of the German bishops joined in a fierce denunciation of Hildebrand and a rejection of his authority as pope, an action for which the approval of the Lombard prelates was speedily secured. Hildebrand's reply was the most famous of medieval papal decrees. At the Roman Synod of February 22, 1076, he excommunicated Henry, forbade him authority over Germany and Italy, and released all Henry's subjects from their oaths of allegiance. 2 It was the boldest assertion of papal authority that had ever been made. To it Henry replied by a fiery letter addressed to Hildebrand, now no pope, but a false monk, in which he called on Hildebrand to come down, to be damned throughout all eternity. Had Henry IV had a united Germany behind him, the result might easily have been Hildebrand's overthrow. Germany was not united. The Saxons and Henry's other political enemies used the opportunity to make him trouble. Even the bishops had regard for the authority of a pope they had nominally rejected. Henry was unable to meet the rising opposition. An assembly of nobles in Triber, in October, 1076, declared that unless released from excommunication within a year he would be deposed, and the pope was invited to a new assembly to meet in Augsburg, in February, 1077, at which the whole German political and religious situation should be considered. Henry was in great danger of losing his throne. It became a matter of vital importance to free himself from excommunication. Hildebrand refused all appeals, he would settle the questions at Augsburg. Henry IV now resolved on a step of the utmost dramatic and political significance. He would meet Hildebrand before the Pope could reach the assembly in Augsburg and wring from him the desired absolution. He crossed the Alps in the winter and sought Hildebrand in northern Italy, through which the Pope was passing on his way to Germany. In doubt whether Henry came in peace or war, Hildebrand sought refuge in the strong castle of Canossa, belonging to his ardent supporter, the Countess Matilda of Tuscany. At the Roman Synod in March, 1080, a second time excommunicated and deposed Henry. The same political weapons can seldom be used twice effectively. Sentiment had crystallized in Germany, and this time the Pope's action had little effect. Henry answered by a synod in Brixen in June, 1080, deposing Hildebrand, and choosing one of Hildebrand's bitterest opponents, Archbishop Wybert of Ravenna, as Pope in his place. Wybert called himself Clement III, 1080–1100. The death of Rudolf in battle, in October following, left Henry stronger in Germany than ever before. He determined to be rid of Hildebrand. In 1081 Henry invaded Italy, but it was 3 years before he gained possession of Rome. Pressed upon by the overwhelming German and Lombard forces, Hildebrand's political supporters proved too weak to offer permanently effective resistance. The Roman people, and no less than 13 of the cardinals, turned to the victorious German ruler and his pope. In March, 1084, Wybert was enthroned, and crowned Henry emperor. Hildebrand, apparently a beaten man, still hied the castle of San Angelo, and absolutely refused any compromise. In May a Norman army came to Hildebrand's relief, but these rough supporters so burned and plundered Rome, that he had to withdraw with them, and after nearly a year of this painful exile, he died in Salerno, on May 25, 1085. Hildebrand's relations to other countries have been passed by in the account of his great struggle with Germany. It may be sufficient to say that his aims were similar, though so engrossed was he in the conflict with Henry IV that he never pushed matters to such an extreme with the kings of England and France. He attempted to bring the high clergy everywhere under his control. He caused extensive codification of church law to be made. He enforced clerical celibacy as not only the theoretical but the practical rule of the Roman Church. If his methods were worldly and unscrupulous, as they undoubtedly were, no misfortune ever caused him to abate his claims, and even in apparent defeat he won a moral victory. The ideals that he had established for the papacy were to live long after him. Section 12. The struggle ends in compromise. On the death of Hildebrand, the cardinals faithful to him chose as his successor Desiderius, the able and scholarly abbot of Monte Cassino, who took the name of Victor III, 1086-1087. So discouraging was the outlook that he long refused the doubtful honor. When at last he accepted it, he quietly dropped Hildebrand's extremer efforts at world rulership, though renewing the prohibition of lay investiture with utmost vigor. He was, however, able to be in Rome but a few days. That city remained in the hands of Wybert, and before the end of 1087 Victor III was no more. The situation of the party of Hildebrand seemed well nigh hopeless. After much hesitation, a few of the reformed cardinals met in Terracina, and chose a French Cluny monk, who had been appointed a cardinal bishop by Hildebrand, Odo of Lagares, as Pope Urban II, 1088-1099. A man of Hildebrandian convictions, without Hildebrand's genius, Urban was far more conciliatory and politically skillful. He sought with great success to create a friendly party among the German clergy, aided thereto by the monks of the influential monastery of Hirschau. He stirred up disaffection for Henry IV, often by no worthy means. Yet it was not till the close of 1093 that Urban was able to take effective possession of Rome and drive out Wybert. His rise in power was thence rapid. At a great synod held in Piacenza in March, 1095, he sounded the note of a crusade. At Clermont in November of the same year he brought the crusade into being, page 239. On the flood of the crusading movement Urban rose at once to a position of European leadership. Henry IV and Wybert might oppose him, but the papacy had achieved a significance compared with which they had nothing to offer. Though men were weary of the long strife, the next pope, Paschal, took the pope and the cardinals prisoners. Paschal weakened. In April, 1111, he resigned to Henry investiture with ring and staff, and crowned him emperor. The Hildebrandian party stormed in protest. At the Roman Synod of March, 1112, Paschal withdrew his agreement, which he could well hold was wrung from him by force. A synod in Vienne in September excommunicated Henry and forbade lay investiture, and this action the Pope approved. Yet the basis of a compromise was already in sight. Two French church leaders, Ivo, Bishop of Chartres, and Hugo of Fleury, in writings between 1099 and 1106, had argued that church and state each had their rights of investiture, the one with spiritual, the other with temporal authority. Anselm, the famous Archbishop of Canterbury, a firm supporter of reform principles, 1093 to 1109, had refused investiture from Henry I of England, 1100 to 1135, and led to a contest which ended in the resignation by the king of investiture with ring and staff, while retaining to the crown investiture with temporal possession by the reception of an oath of fealty. These principles and precedents influenced the further course of the controversy. The compromise came in 1122, in the Concordat of Worms, arranged between Henry V and Pope Calixtus II, 1119 to 1124. By mutual agreement, elections of bishops and abbots in Germany were to be free and in canonical form, yet the presence of the emperor at the choice was allowed, and in case of disputed election he should consult with the metropolitan and other bishops of the province. In other parts of the empire, Burgundy and Italy, no mention was made of the imperial presence. The emperor renounced investiture with ring and staff, too. With the symbols of spiritual authority. In turn, the Pope granted him the right of investiture with the temporal possessions of the office by the touch of the royal scepter, without demand of payment from the candidate. This imperial recognition was to take place in Germany before consecration, and in the other parts of the empire within 6 months thereafter. 1 The effect was that in Germany at least a bishop or abbot must be acceptable both to the church and to the emperor. In Italy the imperial power, which had rested on control of churchly appointments, was greatly broken. It was an outcome of the struggle which would but partially have satisfied Hildebrand. Yet the Church had won much. If not superior to the state, it had vindicated its equality with the temporal power. Section 13. The Greek Church after the picture controversy. The Isaurian dynasty in Constantinople, 717 to 802, witnessed the severe internal conflicts caused by the picture-worshipping controversy, which was in a measure a struggle for the freedom of the Church from imperial control, ante, page 162. It beheld the loss of Rome and of the Exarchate, and the rise of the renewed Western Empire under Charlemagne. The periods of the Phrygian, 820 to 867, and Macedonian dynasties, 867, 1057, were marked by a notable revival of learning, so that, intellectually, the East was decidedly superior to the West. The Patriarch, Photius, whose quarrel with Nicholas I has already been noted, was of eminent scholarship. His Myriobibline is of permanent worth, as preserving much of ancient classical authors otherwise lost. Simeon Metaphrastes compiled his famous collection of the lives of the Eastern saints in the 10th century. In Simeon, the new theologian, 1040, the Greek Church had its noblest mystic, who believed that the revelation of the divine light, the very vision of God, is possible of attainment and is of grace, bringing peace, joy, and justification. Theologically, the Greek world had nothing new to offer. It held with intensity to the traditions of the past. The chief religious controversy in the east of this epoch was that caused by the Paulicians. The origin and history of the movement is obscure. They called themselves Christians simply, their nickname being apparently due to S and copyists. The Catholic hierarchy they repudiated. They opposed the externalism of current Orthodox religious life. The Paulicians seem to have spread rapidly in the Eastern Empire, and to have taken strong root in Armenia. Persecuted by the Orthodox, their military powers procured them considerable respect. Constantine V transplanted colonies of them to the Balkan Peninsula in 752, as a defense against the Bulgarians, a process which was repeated on a larger scale by the Emperor, John Tzimiskes, in 969. There they seem to have given origin to the very similar Bogomiles, who in turn were to be influential in the development of the Kathari of southern France, page 249. Driven to seek refuge among the Saracens, some sections of the Paulicians harassed the borders of the empire in the 9th century, and even penetrated deeply into it, till their military success, though not their religious activity, was permanently checked by the emperor, Basil I, in 871. The latter half of the 9th and the 10th centuries was a period of revived military power for the Eastern Empire, especially under John Tzimiskes, 969 to 976, and Basil II, 976-1025. By the latter, Bulgaria and Armenia were conquered. Internal dissensions and a fear of usurping militarism weakened the empire in the 11th century, so that the rise of the Seljuk Turks found it unprepared. In 1071 the Turks conquered a large part of Asia Minor, and in 1080 established themselves in Nikiye, less than 100 miles from Constantinople. This great loss to Christianity was to be one of the causes leading to the Crusades. Section 14. The spread of the Church. The 10th and 11th centuries were an epoch of large extension of Christianity. Ansgar's work in the Scandinavian lands, ante, page 213, had left few results. Scandinavian Christianization was a slow and gradual process. Uni, Archbishop of Hamburg, 918 to 936, imitated Ansgar, but without great success. The work was carried forward by Archbishop Adeldag, 937 to 988. Under his influence, King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark accepted Christianity, and Danish bishoprics were established. Under Harald's son, Sweyn, heathenism was again in power, but he was brought to favor the Church in 995, and the work was completed in Denmark by King Canute the Great, 1015 to 1035, who also ruled England and, for a time, Norway. The story of Norway is similar. Some Christian beginnings were made under Hakon I, 935 to 961, and missionaries were sent by Harald Bluetooth of Denmark. Christianity in Norway was not permanently established till the time of Olaf I, 995-1000, who brought in English preachers. The work was now extended to the Orkneys, Shetland, Hebrides, Faroe, Iceland, and Greenland, then in Scandinavian possession. Olaf II, 1015–1028, enforced Christianity in Norway with such extreme measures that he was deposed and Canute gained control, yet he lives in tradition as Street Olaf. Magnus T. 10351047, completed the work. In Sweden, after many beginnings from the time of Ansgar, Christianity was effectively established by King Olaf sk Sixth Konung, 994-1024, who was baptized in 1008. Yet the work was slow, and heathenism was not fully overthrown till about 1100. Finland and Lapland were not reached till 2 centuries later. After various efforts in the 10th century, Christianity was effectively established in Hungary by King Stephen I, 997-1038, the organizer of the Hungarian monarchy, who lives in history as Street Stephen. The Polish Duke, Mieczysław, accepted Christianity in 967, and in 1000 King Boleslaus I, 992-1025, organized the Polish Church with an archbishopric in Gnezin. Pomerania was not Christianized till 1124–1128. The movements just considered were the work of the Latin Church. The great extension of the Greek Church lies in this period and was accomplished by the conversion of Russia. Its beginnings are obscure. Efforts for the spread of Christianity in Russia seem to have been made as early as the time of the Patriarch of Constant. Siri and unrest prevailed widely. The more settled conditions of the age made impossible such migrations of nations as had been exhibited in the Germanic invasions at the downfall of the Western Empire. The same desire to change environment was, however, felt. Stimulated by these economic conditions, doubtless, the whole 11th century was a period of deepening religious feeling. Its manifestations took monastic and ascetic forms. It was characterized by a strong sense of otherworldliness, of the misery of earth and the blessedness of heaven. This increasing religious zeal had been the force which had reformed the papacy, and had supported antagonism to simony and Nicolaitanism, and nerved the long struggle with the empire. Those regions where the reform movement had shone brightest, or which had come into closest relations with the reforming papacy, France, Lorraine, and southern Italy, were the recruiting grounds of the chief crusading armies. The piety of the time placed great value on relics and pilgrimages, and what more precious relic could there be, or what nobler pilgrimage shrine, than the land hallowed by the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. That land had been an object of pilgrimage since the days of Constantine. Though Jerusalem had been in Moslem possession since 638, pilgrimages had been, save for brief intervals, practically uninterrupted. They had never been more numerous than in the 11th century, till the conquest of much of Asia Minor, from 1071 onward, and the capture of Jerusalem, by the Seljuk Turks, made pilgrimages almost impossible and desecrated the holy places. It was to an age profoundly impressed with the spiritual advantage of pilgrimages that the news of these things came. The time, moreover, was witnessing successful contests with Mohammedanism. Between 1060 and 1090 the Normans of southern Italy had wrested Sicily from the Moslems. Under Ferdinand I of Castile, 1028–1065, the effective Christian reconquest of Spain from the Mohammedans had begun. The later 11th century is the age of the Cid, 1040–1099. The feeling was widespread that Christianity could dispossess Mohammedanism. Love of adventure, hopes for plunder, desire for territorial advancement and religious hatred, undoubtedly moved the Crusaders with very earthly impulses. We should wrong them, however, if we did not recognize with equal clearness that they thought they were doing something of the highest importance for their souls and for Christ. The first impulse to the Crusades came from an appeal of the Eastern Emperor, Michael VII, 1067–1078, to Hildebrand for aid against the Seljuks. That great pope, to whom this seemed to promise the reunion of Greek and Latin Christendom, took the matter up in 1074, and was able to report to Henry IV of Germany that 50,000 men were ready to go under the proper leadership. The speedy outbreak of the investiture struggle frustrated the plan. It was effectively to be revived by Urban II, the heir in so many directions of Hildebrand. Alexius I, 1081–1118, a stronger ruler than his immediate predecessors in Constantinople, felt unable to cope with the perils which threatened the empire. He, therefore, appealed to Urban II for assistance. Urban received the imperial messengers at the synod in Piacenza, in northern Italy, in March, 1095, and promised his help. At the synod held in Clermont, eastern France, in the following November, Urban now proclaimed the crusade in an appeal of almost unexampled consequence. The enterprise had magnified in his conception from that of aid to the hard-pressed Alexius to a general rescue of the holy places from Moslem hands. He called on all Christendom to take part in the work, promising forgiveness of sins to all and eternal life to those who should fall in the enterprise. The message found immediate and enthusiastic response. Among the popular preachers who took it up none was more famous than Peter the Hermit, a monk from Amy. He joined the main crusading force, and survived the perils of the expedition. The real work of the First Crusade was accomplished by the feudal nobility of Europe. 3 great armies were raised. That from Lorraine and Belgium included Godfrey of Bouillon, the moral hero of the crusade, since he commanded the respect due to his single-minded and unselfish devotion to its aims, though not its ablest general. With Godfrey were his brothers, Baldwin and Eustace. Other armies from northern France were led by Hugh of Vermandois and Robert of Normandy. From southern France came a large force under Count Raymond of Toulouse, and from Norman Italy a well-equipped army led by Bohemond of Taranto and his nephew Tancred. The earliest of these forces started in August, 1096. No single commander led the hosts. Urban II had appointed Bishop Adhemar of Puy his legate, and Adhemar designated Constantinople as the gathering place. Thither each army made its way as best it could, arriving there in the winter and spring of 1096 to 1097, and causing Alexius no little difficulty by their disorder and demands. In May, 1097, the crusading army began the siege of Nicaea. Its surrender followed in June. On July 1 a great victory over the Turks near Dorylaeum opened the route across Asia Minor, so that Iconium was reached, after severe losses through hunger and thirst, by the middle of August. By October the crusading host was before the walls of Antioch. That city it captured only after a difficult siege, on June 3, 1098. 3 days later the Crusaders were besieged in the city by the Turkish ruler Kerboga of Mosul. The crisis of the crusade was this time of peril and despair, but on June 28 Kerboga was completely defeated. Yet it was not till June, 1099, that Jerusalem was reached, and not till July 15 that it was captured and its inhabitants put to the sword. The complete defeat of an Egyptian relieving army near Ascalon on August 12, 1099, crowned the success of the crusade. On the completion of the work, Godfrey of Bouillon was chosen protector of the Holy Sepulchre. He died in July, 1100, and was succeeded by his abler brother, who had established a Latin county in Edessa, and now took the title of King Baldwin I, 1100 to 1118. The Crusaders were from the feudal West, and the country was divided and organized in full feudal fashion. It included, besides the Holy Land, the Principality of Antioch, and the counties of Tripoli and Edessa, which were practically independent of the King of Jerusalem. In the towns important Italian business settlements sprang up, but most of the knights were French. Under a patriarch of the Latin Rite in Jerusalem, the country was divided into 4 archbishoprics and 10 bishoprics, and numerous monasteries were established. The greatest support of the kingdom soon came to be the military orders. Of these, that of the Templars was founded by Hugo de Payens in 1119, and granted quarters near the site of the temple, hence their name, by King Baldwin II, 1118 to 1131. Through the hearty support of Bernard of Clairvaux the order received papal approval in 1128, and soon won wide popularity in the West. Its members took the usual monastic vows and pledged themselves, in addition, to fight for the defense of the Holy Land and to protect pilgrims. They were not clergy, but laymen. In some respects the order was like a modern missionary society. Those who sympathized with the crusade, but were debarred by age or sex from a personal share in the work, gave largely that they might be represented by others through the order. Since property was mostly in land, the Templars soon became great landholders in the West. Their independence and wealth made them objects of royal jealousy, especially after their original purpose had been frustrated by the end of the Crusades, and led to their brutal suppression in France in 1307 by King Philip IV, 1285–1314. While the Crusades lasted, they were a main bulwark of the Kingdom of Jeru. Steinization. In spite of feudal disorganization, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was fairly successful till the capture of Edessa by the Mohammedans in 1144 robbed it of its northeastern bulwark. Bernard of Clairvaux, now at the height of his fame, proclaimed a new crusade and enlisted Louis VII of France, 1137–1180, and the Emperor Conrad III, 1138–1152, from Germany in 1146. In 1147 the Second Crusade set forth, but it showed little of the fiery enthusiasm of its predecessor. Its forces largely perished in Asia Minor, and such as reached Palestine were badly defeated in an attempt to take Damascus, in 1148. It was a disastrous failure, and its collapse left a bitter feeling in the West toward the Eastern Empire, to whose princes that failure, rightly or wrongly, was charged. One reason of the success of the Latin kingdom had been the quarrels of the Mohammedans. In 1171 the Kurdish general, Saladin, made himself master of Egypt. By 1174 he had secured Damascus, and by 1183 Saladin's territory surrounded the Latin kingdom on the north, east, and south. A united Mohammedanism had now to be met. Results soon followed. At Hattin the Latin army was defeated in July, 1187. The loss of Jerusalem and of most of the Holy Land speedily followed. The news of this catastrophe roused Europe to the Third Crusade, 1189–1192. None of the Crusades was more elaborately equipped. Three great armies were led by the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, 1152–1190, the first soldier of his age, by King Philip Augustus of France, 1179–1223, and by King Richard, Sieur de Lion, of England, 1189–1199. Frederick was accidentally drowned in Cilicia. His army, deprived of his vigorous leadership, was utterly ineffective. The quarrels between the kings of France and England, and Philip's speedy return to France to push his own political schemes, rendered the whole expedition almost abortive. Acre was recovered, but Jerusalem remained in Moslem possession. The Fourth Crusade, 1202–1204, was a small affair as far as numbers engaged, but of important political and religious consequences. Its forces were from the districts of northern France known as Champagne and Blois, and from Flanders. Men had become convinced that the true route to the recovery of Jerusalem was the preliminary conquest of Egypt. The Crusaders therefore bargained with the Venetians for transportation thither. Unable to raise the full cost, they accepted the proposition of the Venetians that, in lieu of the balance due, they stop on their way and conquer Zara from Hungary for Venice. This they did. A much greater proposal was now made to them. They should stop at Constantinople, and assist in dethroning the imperial usurper, Alexius III, 1195–1203. Alexius, son of the deposed Isaac II, promised the Crusaders large payment and help on their expedition provided they would overthrow the usurper, and crafty Venice saw bright prospects of increased trade. Western hatred of the Greeks contributed. Though Pope Innocent III forbade this division of purpose, the Crusaders were persuaded. Alexius III was easily driven from his throne, but the other Alexius was unable to keep his promises to the Crusaders, who now with the Venetians, in 1204, captured Constantinople, and plundered its treasures. No booty was more eagerly sought than the relics in the churches, which now went to enrich the places of worship of the West. Baldwin of Flanders was made emperor, and a large portion of the Eastern Empire was divided, feudal fashion, among Western knights. Venice obtained a considerable part and a monopoly of trade. A Latin patriarch of Constantinople was appointed, and the Greek Church made subject to the Pope. The Eastern Empire still continued, though it was not to regain Constantinople till 1261. This Latin conquest was disastrous. It greatly weakened the Eastern Empire, and augmented the hatred between Greek and Latin Christianity. A melancholy episode was the so-called Children's Crusade of 1212. A chef was once more in Christian keeping till 1244, when it was permanently lost. The crusading spirit was now well nigh spent, though Louis IX of France, St. Louis, 1226–1270, led a disastrous expedition against Egypt in 1248–1250, in which he was taken prisoner, and an attack on Tunis in 1270, in which he lost his life. The last considerable expedition was that of Prince Edward, soon to be Edward I of England, 1272–1307, in 1271 and 1272. In 1291, the last of the Latin holdings in Palestine was lost. The Crusades were over, though men continued to talk of new expeditions for nearly 2 centuries more. Viewed from the aspect of their purpose, the Crusades were failures. They made no permanent conquest of the Holy Land. It may be doubted whether they greatly retarded the advance of Mohammedanism. Their cost in lives and treasure was enormous. Though initiated in a high spirit of devotion, their methods at best were not those which modern Christianity regards as illustrative of the gospel, and their conduct was disgraced throughout by quarrels, divided motives, and low standards of personal conduct. When their indirect results are examined, however, a very different estimate is to be made of their worth. Civilization is the result of so complex factors that it is hard to assign precise values to single causes. Europe would have made progress during this period had there been no Crusades. But the changes wrought are so remarkable that the conclusion is unavoidable that the largest single influence was that of the Crusades. By the commerce which the Crusades stimulated, the cities of northern Italy and of the great trade route over the Alps and down the Rhine rose to importance. By the sacrifices of feudal lands and property which they involved, a new political element, that of the towns, a third estate, was greatly stimulated, especially in France. The mental horizon of the Western world was immeasurably extended. Thousands who had grown up in the densest ignorance and narrow-mindedness were brought into contact with the splendid cities and ancient civilization of the East. Everywhere there was intellectual awakening. The period witnessed the highest theological development of the Middle Ages, that of scholasticism. It beheld great popular religious movements, in and outside of the Church. It saw the development of the universities. In it, the study of Roman law became a transforming influence. Modern vernacular literature began to flourish. A great artistic development, the national architecture of northern France, misnamed the Gothic, now ran its glorious career. The Europe of the period of the Crusades was awake and enlightened compared with the centuries which had gone before. Admitting that the Crusades were but one factor